Britain in the 1950s, from rubble to routine. The year was 1950. Britain was quiet, but not at peace. The streets bore the bruises of war, and so did the people. Bombed-out buildings stood like broken teeth in city skylines, weeds pushing through cracks where homes and shops once stood. But beneath the rubble, something remarkable was beginning to stir. A deep, quiet determination to rebuild, not just buildings, but life itself. Everyday routines carried a kind of ritual importance. Families queued outside shops with ration books in hand, hoping to find butter or sugar. Meat was a rare treat. Even sweets were strictly measured. Meals stretched thin with bread, potatoes, and ingenuity. Women patched trousers, turned dresses inside out for younger siblings, and made coats from old curtains. Nothing was wasted. Every spoonful, every scrap, carried the memory of wartime scarcity. Still, hope flickered in small things. Council estates rose where bomb craters once yawned open. For many working-class families, this was their first taste of modern living. Indoor plumbing, electricity, even a garden of their own. Entire new towns like Stevenage and Harlow sprouted from blank land, promising a future of planned streets, clean schools, and neighborly quiet. Children played in alleys, climbed trees near construction sites, or ran errands to the corner shop with a sixpence tucked into their pocket. Radios crackled with family dramas or light entertainment. And while television was still rare, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 changed that. Across the nation, living rooms filled with neighbors huddled around a single flickering screen, watching history unfold. It was a moment of pride and, quietly, of progress. Life was not easy, but it was shared. There was structure in the week: Sunday roasts, laundry Mondays, fish on Fridays. Doors were left unlocked. Neighbors knew each other's names, jobs, and birthdays. The milkman didn't just deliver bottles, he brought news. The grocer kept an extra loaf behind the counter for your mum. Children borrowed sugar from the neighbor's kitchen. In a world of limited means, kindness was currency. Looking back, the 1950s in Britain were not glamorous, but they were deeply human. This was a nation knitting itself back together, thread by thread. In the next part, we'll explore how Britain transformed from these gray post-war streets into the dazzling color and chaos of the 1960s. A cultural explosion was just around the corner. And if you find these stories spark a memory, or simply make you pause and reflect, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories like this waiting to be remembered. Let's keep them alive, together. Britain in the 1960s, when color replaced gray. If the 1950s were years of quiet rebuilding, the 1960s arrived like a burst of light after a long, dim winter. By early 1960, the British public was ready to move from making do to dressing up, from ration books to record shops, from silence to singing. You could feel the shift everywhere. Those new homes and estates built during Reconstruction began to reflect domestic pride. Front gardens blooming, radios playing pop records late into the night, and lives that no longer revolved around queues and hand-me-downs. The term "swinging London" wasn't just a catchy phrase, it summed up a mood. Carnaby Street and King's Road turned into runways of youth culture. Miniskirts swirled under fluorescent lights. Tailored suits squeezed into smart shops. London was no longer recovering. It was rewriting itself as a global hub of style and sound. As a historian and unabashed nostalgic, I believe the 1960s marked a pivotal moment when Britain stopped looking inward and started inviting the world in. Music wasn't just a background soundtrack anymore. It was the voice of a generation. Bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones didn't just sell records, they sold ideas. Suddenly, British accents ruled American airwaves, and teenagers everywhere realized they could shape culture. And let's not overlook the social undercurrents. The decade brought real momentum to long-suppressed movements. The legalization of homosexuality, 1967, the divorce law reform, and relaxation of censorship weren't just headline news. They were signs that a society long mired in tradition was learning to breathe again. Fashion, too, became a statement of independence. Miniskirts designed by Mary Quant weren't just short. They were a challenge to convention. Men's suits grew brighter, slimmer, and more daring. In every fold of fabric echoed a desire. We are new, we are different, we are free. Yet it's important to remember the 1960s were not entirely carefree. The immigrant voices of Afro-Caribbean, South Asian, and African communities were reshaping cityscapes, but not always being welcomed. These changes planted the seeds of modern multicultural Britain, but also exposed deep tensions. Integration was easier to describe than to enact. I always wonder, if you were a teenager then, how did it feel to finally see your reflection in film, in fashion, in music? Many felt they were stepping into a personal revolution. For many working-class and immigrant families, the 1960s were a chance, not just for shimmer and shine, but for a shot at belonging. The stores still offered bargains, but now those bargains included mod fashion, top 40 singles, and futuristic home appliances. By the end of the decade, Britain looked unrecognizable compared to 10 years earlier. The people had changed what they wore, watched, sang, and spoke about. Insight. The 1960s showed that material recovery is only one part of transformation. True change occurs when society alters its image, its voice, and its aspirations. Coming up, we'll explore the cracks beneath the glitter, how the mood shifted when economic problems, strikes, and uncertainty returned in the 1970s. If these stories feel like glimpses into your own family's past, or they spark a deeper curiosity, please consider subscribing. You're not just watching history, you're preserving it. One generation at a time. Britain in the 1970s. When trenches turned to chaos. If the 1960s were Britain's bright, defiant youth, the 1970s were its uneasy adolescence. The flair and freedom didn't vanish, but under the surface, economic uncertainty and social tension began to bubble over. The country was still dancing, but now to a different, more chaotic beat. At first glance, the 70s still shimmered. Fashion was bold. Glam rock strutted onto the stage with sequins and swagger. The TV screens were filled with edgy drama, satirical comedy, and fearless commentary. Punk exploded not just as a genre, but as a guttural cry against stagnation. The youth still had energy, but now it was often laced. But let's not sugarcoat it. Behind the glitter, Britain was in TR. By the mid-70s, inflation soared. Fuel prices doubled. And for the first time in decades, people weren't just tightening belts. They were bracing for real hardship. It's one thing to live frugally by choice. It's quite another when your paycheck buys less each month. One of the most vivid memories from those years? Queuing for petrol. The oil crisis of 1973 hit like a thunderclap. Long lines at filling stations became a common sight, engines idling, radios playing quietly while drivers waited. And waited. The idea that Britain, this proud industrial nation, could run out of fuel shook people to the core. The government's answer? A 3-day working week. Factories went dark for days at a time. Offices were cold. TV stations signed off early to save electricity. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was symbolic. This was no longer a nation riding the wave of progress. It was one trying not to drown. And then came the strikes. It felt like everything stopped working. Bin collectors, train drivers, miners, even gravediggers walked out. Streets piled high with uncollected rubbish. Public transport vanished. Funerals were delayed. The famous Winter of Discontent in 1978-79 wasn't just a headline, it was a nationwide paralysis. But here's the deeper story. These strikes weren't just about wages. They were about dignity, power, and whose voice mattered in post-war Britain. The balance between unions and government, between labor and leadership, was tilting, violently. Entire industries began collapsing. Coal, steel, shipbuilding, names that had once built cities and families, began disappearing. And when a factory closed in those days, it wasn't just jobs lost. It was identity, pride, purpose. In towns built around a single industry, when the gates shut, the heart stopped beating. I remember stories of families who once thrived on skilled labor, suddenly forced to scrape by. Parents retraining, kids dropping out early, high streets filled with empty storefronts. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was an emotional one. Yet, amid the hardship, new movements emerged. The feminist movement in Britain pushed harder than ever for equal pay, workplace rights, and control over reproductive health. Environmental awareness began to stir, with growing concerns about pollution and sustainability. These were voices rising from the ashes of uncertainty, demanding a future that didn't repeat the past. And music, always music, remained a barometer. From Bowie's otherworldly personas to the raw rage of The Clash, British culture didn't retreat, it roared. Insight. The 1970s tested Britain's resilience. It exposed weaknesses, but also provoked conversations the country needed to have about power, identity, and whether the old ways were worth saving. In Part 4, we'll see how the 1980s redrew the map entirely, economically, politically, and socially. A decade of contrasts, wealth and joblessness, private ownership and public losses. And if you want to keep exploring these forgotten moments that shaped modern Britain, subscribe now. Every story we remember is a piece of who we still are. Britain in the 1980s, reinvention and reckoning. The dawn of the 1980s. In Britain wasn't just another page in history, it was the start of a whole new chapter, one that promised bold reform but came with a hefty price. The mood had shifted. The struggles of the 70s left the nation exhausted, and the promise of a new direction, no matter how controversial, found traction. And that direction came fast. With the rise of Margaret Thatcher and the sweeping changes of her government, Britain began to unravel the post-war consensus that had shaped society for nearly 4 decades. The economy, once steered with a sense of shared welfare, was now recast through the lens of free markets, deregulation, and privatization. On the surface, things sparkled. The City of London boomed with financial deregulation, creating a new class of yuppies, young, ambitious professionals in sharp suits and faster cars. Home ownership soared, thanks to the Right to Buy scheme, allowing council tenants to purchase their homes, often at a discount. For many families, it felt like a step into prosperity. It gave people a stake, a sense of pride. But not everyone shared in that success. As traditional industries, coal mining, shipbuilding, steel, were restructured or shut down, entire towns across the North and Midlands were left hollowed out. Generations of skilled laborers saw their livelihoods erased. In these places, boarded-up factories and record-high unemployment became the new landscape. The 1984-85 miners' strike was perhaps the most defining symbol of the decade's divisions. It wasn't just a labor dispute. It was a full-blown confrontation between government and working-class communities who believed they were being sacrificed on the altar of progress. The images from that period, riot police facing off against picketers, headlines screaming division, are still etched into Britain's memory. Behind closed doors, families felt this tension too. While some saw the 80s as a golden age of opportunity, others experienced it as a time of rising inequality, crumbling social services, and growing isolation. The very notion of community, so strong in the decades prior, seemed to fray. Yet this was also the decade when technology entered everyday life in a meaningful way. The living room now had a VCR. Kids were saving up for their first personal stereo or cassette tape. Early home computers like the ZX Spectrum or BBC Micro hinted at futures beyond the factory floor. Entertainment, once shared communally, was becoming more individual, on-demand, portable, personal. Retail, too, began its transformation. Shopping malls and branded chain stores multiplied. High streets started losing their local character, replaced by the consistency of national brands. It was convenient, yes, but something intangible began to slip away. Here's the insight. The 1980s redefined what success looked like in Britain. It offered ownership, freedom, and choice, but at a cost. The cost was often community, identity, and the sense that society moved forward together. By the end of the decade, Britain stood more modern, more global, but also more divided. In the next part, we'll reflect on the deeper meaning of this transformation, What did Britain gain in those 4 decades, and what was quietly lost along the way? And if this journey through time resonates with you, remember to subscribe. These aren't just facts, they're the shared roots of who we are. Let's remember them together. What Britain gained, what it lost, 1950-1980. By the time Britain stepped out of the 1980s, it had traveled a long, winding road from the rubble-strewn streets of 1950. Decade by decade, the nation reimagined itself, economically, culturally, and socially. And yet, the journey left behind more than just landmarks of progress. It also left questions about what was gained and what might have quietly slipped away. Let's begin with what changed for the better. Materially, life improved. Most households that in 1950 had no central heating or indoor toilets now had full bathrooms, color televisions, refrigerators, and even video cassette players. By the 1980s, a family of modest income could own a car, take a foreign holiday, and choose from a supermarket shelf packed with food from around the world. Opportunities expanded. Education reforms in the 60s and 70s opened the doors of higher education to broader social classes. Women had more choices, not just in work or dress, but in how they lived their lives. Legislation, like the Equal Pay Act or access to birth control, changed not just policies but futures. Social mobility, while uneven, was at least more attainable than it had been in the rigid class structures of pre-war Britain. Voices that had been silent began to speak. Immigrant communities, women, environmental activists, and younger generations all found ways to influence culture and policy. British music, film, and fashion became world-leading, powered by this mix of diversity and creativity. But with all that change, something more subtle began to erode: the quiet rituals of community. In the 1950s, you knew your neighbor's name. The milkman might stop for a chat. Shopkeepers held items aside for regular customers. These weren't luxuries. They were the connective tissue of daily life. As life modernized, convenience often replaced connection. The collapse of industry meant more than just jobs lost. It meant identities lost. Being a miner or a shipbuilder wasn't just a profession. It was a source of pride, a family lineage, a way of being part of something bigger. When those industries vanished, it wasn't just paychecks that disappeared. It was the stories people passed down, the rhythms of shared labor and common purpose. Consumerism took center stage, where earlier generations had asked, "What can I do for my country, for my family, for my town?" The 1980s increasingly asked, "What can I buy?" The rise of the individual brought new freedoms, but also a certain solitude. Self-expression blossomed, but collective meaning weakened. And so, as Britain became more connected to the global stage, it became slightly less connected to itself. Here's the core of it all. Progress isn't just about what you build. It's also about what you remember to carry with you. Britain gained technology, wealth, choice, and global influence. But along the way, it risked losing the warmth of its local cultures, the patience of slow living, and the strength found in shared struggle. As we head into our final part, we'll ask the question many have wondered: was the cost of modernity worth it? And what parts of that old Britain are still worth holding on to today? And if that question makes you pause, even just for a second, hit that subscribe button. We're not just telling stories, we're holding onto the threads that connect us all. Echoes of the past, questions for the future. By the close of 1980, Britain stood on the edge of something unfamiliar. The soot-streaked factories were going silent. The village shops were turning into chain stores. And the rhythm of daily life, once set by the whistle of the train, the chime of the milk float, or the hymn sung at Sunday service, was being drowned out by the hum of progress. It's easy, from today's vantage point, to look back with rose-tinted glasses, to remember the street parties, the school uniforms, the smell of coal in winter, and the feel of pocket money warming in your hand as you walked into Woolworths. But nostalgia, while comforting, can blur the truth. The past was not perfect, but it was human. People knew each other, struggles were shared, and even when life was hard, there was often a kind of dignity in the doing. So what does that leave us with now? We live in an age of speed, instant messages, next-day delivery, streaming on demand. We have more access to knowledge, choice, and comfort than any generation before us. And yet, loneliness is on the rise. Local communities feel fractured. Our grandparents' slow, grounded world can feel like it existed on a different planet. But here's the thing. The future doesn't have to erase the past. It can learn from it. We don't have to give up community just because we gained connectivity. We don't have to lose history in our pursuit of innovation. And we can choose to carry the best of what came before, resilience, kindness, neighborhood, honesty, into the world we're still building. That's why stories like this matter. They're not just about what happened. They're about how it shaped who we are, and perhaps, more importantly, how they can still shape who we choose to become. So, whether you lived through those decades or you're hearing them for the first time, take a moment. Think of the high street you once walked, the neighbor who helped your family, the music that made you feel seen. Those things didn't vanish. They live on in memory, in story, in you. And if you believe these echoes are worth keeping alive, hit that subscribe button. Join us as we continue to tell the stories that shaped generations, because the past isn't gone. It's just waiting to be remembered.